In 1945, as World War II comes to an end, 3 people knock on the door of an isolated mansion, lost in the fog of Jersey Island. These 3 people, Mr. Tuttle, Mrs. Mills, and Lydia, a young woman mute from a mysterious trauma, are former servants of the house looking for work. A pale young woman opens the door for them. This is Grace Stewart, mother of 2 children, and Nicholas Stewart, affected by a rare and incurable disease, erythropoietic protoporphyria, a disease that makes them extremely sensitive to daylight. Mrs. Stewart is always impatient to hear news from her husband, who has gone to the front. The latter, who just happens to need servants and a new wet nurse to take care of the children, hires them. She explains a rule to them to protect her children from the light. One must never open a door before closing the previous one. But her arrival coincides with the appearance of numerous strange events. First, while she has separated the children to give them a lesson, Mrs. Stewart believes she hears cries in the mansion that do not come from either of her 2 children, whom she has locked in 2 different rooms. In the music room, and Stewart then tells her about Victor, the son of the others whom she claims to have seen several times and who share the room with her. Mrs. Stewart does not pay attention to what she believes are lies, but she notices that someone has opened the door to the room. Mad with rage, she verbally lashes out at the servants, reminding them of the mansion's rules. As night falls, in her room, and speaks again about Victor with her brother Nicholas, telling him that he is there, in the room with them, and that she can see him. She accuses the intruder of opening the curtains, which prevents them from sleeping. Nicholas doesn't believe a word of what she claims and thinks she is mocking him. Suddenly, a hand comes to touch his cheek while his sister remains motionless. Terrified, the boy feels another presence in the room and screams with all his might, alerting Grace, who scolds her daughter for making her brother nervous. The next day, he hears loud noises on the roof that he attributes to Lydia, the mute maid, before realizing his mistake upon seeing her outside the mansion through the window. When she goes upstairs to check, there is no one, but she hears voices and laughter. In the kitchen, and then shows him a drawing of the others, a group of 4 people, 2 spouses, a child, and an elderly woman with a witch-like appearance, and claims to see them often, emphasizing the fact that she has crossed paths with the mysterious old woman more than a dozen times. Stewart arms himself with a rifle and searches the entire mansion from top to bottom with the servants. And it is in the attic where he discovers a curious album that contains photographs of all the deceased members of the previous families who have lived in the mansion. One night, while on duty, Mrs. Stewart hears someone playing the piano in the music room that she had locked. When she enters the room, the piano, which is usually closed, is open, and there is no one there. The piano starts playing by itself several times before what seems to be a violent draft closes the door, causing the children's mother to fall to the ground. Very shaken, she decides to go find a priest and tell him everything. During all this time, the attitude of the 3 servants seems increasingly unsettling, just like that event the children refer to without daring to speak, which concerns their mother. While lost in the fog, Mrs. Stewart finds her husband Charles wandering, looking dazed. Crazy with joy to find him, she takes him back home. He has become a shadow of himself, completely disconnected from his wife and children, as if absent, forever marked by the traumas of war. In good spirits again, he helps his daughter try on the communion dress and lets her play in a locked room. but upon her return, and takes on the appearance of the old woman that she and Nicholas said they had seen before. Grace violently attacks this ghost to save him, but as she strikes her, she realizes that it is no longer the mysterious woman, but once again her daughter, who looks at her in terror. The latter screams at Mrs. Mills that her mother had tried to kill her. Convinced she is going crazy, she goes to join Charles in his room. He asks her strange questions about her relationship with her children and announces that he must leave. Between sobs, Mrs. Stewart announces that she has waited a long time for his return from the war, praying every night for him to come back to her. Moved by her words, Charles gently embraces his wife and they make love in their marital bed. When Mrs. Stewart wakes up the next morning, he is no longer there. For their part, the children are terrified by the disappearance of all the flowers, mysteriously plucked during the night. While she searches for them desperately, the servants seem unconcerned. She accuses them of tormenting the family, points her rifle at them, orders Mrs. Mills to hand over her bunch of keys, and throws them out of the mansion. Grace manages to seal the children's room, and the day goes by. That same night, Anne, who is angry with her mother, decides to run away from the family home with her brother to go look for their father. It is in the park surrounding the property that she discovers the graves of the 3 servants. The 3 ghosts then reappear in the park and approach Anne and Nicholas, who take refuge in the house, screaming in terror. At the same time, Mrs. Stewart finds the photograph of the bodies of the 3 servants, who have actually been dead for 50 years. The servants chase the children who gather with their mother in front of the mansion. Armed with her rifle, she opens fire several times at the assailants, but the bullets pass through them. Madame Mills responds that they have been dead from tuberculosis for half a century. As a last resort, Mrs. Stewart locks herself in the mansion with her children. Anne and Nicholas go upstairs and hide in a closet where they are discovered by the old witch that Anne claims to have seen. Meanwhile, the servants urge Mrs. Stewart to join her children to find out what really happened. After going upstairs in turn, she discovers the intruders sitting around a table and comes into contact with the elderly woman who is actually a seer. The latter, in a trance state, writes down all the words of Anne and Nicholas so that the rest of the group of intruders can read them. The seer declares that Mrs. Stewart, in a fit of rage, suffocated her children with a pillow. It was the event the children dared not speak of and that she could not accept. The 2 children scream that they are not dead while Grace lifts the table in a fit of rage. She tears the pages where the seer wrote her words, under the horrified gaze of the others, who are actually a family of the living that has just moved into the mansion. Mrs. Stewart, her children, and the servants are actually ghosts who inhabit involuntarily. After the séance, the others are in shock for having contacted the dead. Indignant, the group's wife declares that Mrs. Stewart shot herself with her rifle after having murdered her own children. She recalls that Anne Stewart briefly possessed the medium's body, which explains why she had taken her appearance in front of Mrs. Stewart, and that her son Victor is constantly terrorized by the ghosts. She insists adamantly on moving, refusing to raise her son under such conditions. The next day, the others leave the place, leaving the house to the 6 ghosts. In the hallways of the home, Mrs. Stewart caresses her children and announces to them that Charles, their father, has been dead on the front for a long time. His ghost returned to torment them before leaving one last time. They swear that the mansion is theirs and that they will defend it against new owners.